In the summer of 1852, long before railroads stitched the countryside together and before the land forgot its older secrets, there stood an estate in the river plains of eastern Georgia that people avoided speaking about directly. They didn't refuse to speak of it outright. That would have drawn attention. Instead, they spoke around it. They'd mention the land, how fertile it was, how the soil clung black and heavy to the roots of cotton and tobacco. They'd mention the family who owned it, the Hawthorns, always with careful politeness, always with a tone that suggested respect just slightly forced. But they never spoke of the structure at the far edge of the fields. It was not hidden. In fact, it stood in full view, about a quarter-mile from the main house, a tall, aging granary built from thick timber beams, its slanted roof sagging just enough to betray its years. Anyone riding past the estate could see it clearly. And yet, somehow, no one ever truly looked at it. For nearly 30 years, it had remained sealed. No worker entered it. No child played near it. No visitor asked about it twice. The Hawthorne family ensured that. And for just as long, something inside that structure had been kept carefully out of sight, not abandoned, not forgotten, but deliberately erased. Until the summer a government clerk arrived with ink-stained fingers and too many questions. His name was Elias Carter. He was 29 years old, thin to the point of appearing fragile, with a habit of observing quietly before speaking. Originally from Pennsylvania, Elias had taken the position of census enumerator not out of ambition, but necessity. Still, he approached his work with an unusual seriousness. To him, counting people wasn't just clerical duty, it was a matter of record, of existence. If a name wasn't written down, it might as well vanish. And Elias had always disliked things that vanished too easily. He arrived at the Hawthorne estate on a dry afternoon in late June, the heat pressing down like a physical weight. His horse was exhausted, his shirt clung damp to his back, and dust coated everything he owned. The plantation rose slowly into view, first the fields, then the rows of small cabins, and finally the main house perched on slightly higher ground, white-painted but weather-worn. It was not the largest estate he had seen. But something about it felt restrained. Orderly. Too orderly. A man was waiting on the porch when Elias approached. Tall, broad-shouldered, with silver threaded through dark hair and a face marked by both authority and fatigue. "Mr. Carter, I presume," the man said. Elias nodded, dismounting. "Yes, sir." Elias Carter. Census office. The man extended his hand. Jonathan Hawthorne. His grip was firm, but not welcoming. Inside, the house was cool and dim, the curtains drawn just enough to keep the sun from invading. Elias was offered water, which he accepted gratefully, and they sat across from one another at a polished wooden table. Elias opened his ledger. "Let's begin with household residence," he said. Jonathan Hawthorne spoke clearly, confidently. Jonathan Hawthorne, age 61. My wife, Eleanor, 43. My son Daniel, 20. My daughter Clara, 18. Elias wrote quickly, his pen scratching softly. Any others residing within the main household? A pause. Brief, but noticeable. My eldest son, Nathaniel, Jonathan said finally. He resides on the property but manages separate operations. Elias nodded, noting it down. Everything seemed in order. At first. The unease didn't arrive all at once. It came in small details. A hesitation here. A glance there. The way Jonathan's voice remained controlled, but never relaxed. Elias had conducted enough of these counts to recognize when something wasn't quite aligned. Still, he said nothing. Not yet. Over the next 2 days, he worked through the estate. He counted laborers in the fields, families in the cabins, overseers, craftsmen. The process was familiar. Faces blurred together, voices blended into one another, and yet Elias always listened carefully, because sometimes the truth appeared in what people almost said. And here, there were many things almost said. A woman hesitated when naming who lived in her cabin. A boy mentioned someone who used to come at night, then quickly fell silent. An older man, when asked about the estate, simply shook his head and muttered, "Some things ain't meant for counting." Elias wrote nothing of that down. But he remembered it. By the evening of the second day, the numbers didn't match. They were close. Too close to be accidental. 8 individuals unaccounted for. Not missing in the usual sense, no clear deaths, no sales properly recorded, no runaways documented. Just, absent. As if they had slipped between lines on the page. Elias sat alone that evening, reviewing his ledger again and again. 8 people. Not a mistake. Not coincidence. Something deliberate. That was when he noticed the granary. He had seen it before, of course. Everyone did. But this time, he truly looked. It stood apart from everything else. Too solid. A dangerous one. He would not leave without understanding. Because numbers mattered. Records mattered. People mattered. And somewhere on that estate, 8 people had been erased. He waited until the house had gone still. No footsteps. No voices. Only the distant hum of insects and the heavy silence of the southern night. Taking a small lantern and a set of simple tools from his satchel, Elias stepped outside. The air was thick, unmoving. Every sound felt louder than it should. Every step deliberate. The walk to the granary felt longer than it had during the day. Shadows stretched strangely across the ground. The structure loomed larger with every step. By the time he reached it, his heart was pounding. Not from fear alone. But from certainty. Whatever was inside. It explained everything. The lock was old, but well maintained. Not decorative. Functional. It took time. Care. Patience. But eventually, it clicked. The chain loosened. The doors creaked open, slow and heavy, like something resisting. Elias raised the lantern. Light spilled into darkness. And what he saw was not what he expected. The granary was not empty. It had never been meant for grain. It was a room. A living space. A bed. A table. Books stacked carefully in one corner. Clothing folded with care. A basin. A chair. Signs of long-term habitation. Not storage. Not abandonment. But life. Hidden. Contained. Elias stepped inside slowly, his breath shallow. Someone had lived here. For a long time. But they were not here now. The bed was disturbed. The air still held a faint warmth of recent presence. And on the table, there was a journal. His hands trembled as he opened it. The first entry was dated 1823. And the first line read, "I have been told I must no longer be seen." Elias swallowed hard. And began to read. Elias did not realize how long he stood there, holding the journal beneath the dim glow of his lantern. The air inside the granary felt unnaturally still, heavy in a way that made every breath feel deliberate. The space was not abandoned, it was preserved. Every object had a purpose, every corner carefully maintained, as if the person who lived there had fought against being forgotten. He turned the page. The handwriting was precise and elegant, far more refined than what Elias had encountered among most of the people he had recorded. This was someone educated, someone taught with care, someone who clearly belonged to a world far different from the one they had been confined to. The first line he read made his chest tighten. "They say I am fortunate. That I am not sent away like others. That I am kept close, provided for, protected. But I do not feel fortunate. I feel erased. Elias exhaled slowly and turned to the next entries, reading more quickly now. The journal stretched across years, each entry carefully dated. Whoever had written it had clung to time itself, as though marking each day was the only way to prove they still existed. 1827, Father visited again today. He brought me 2 books and news of the world beyond the fields. He says I must be patient, that things will not always be this way. I do not believe him anymore. Elias paused, his mind catching on a single word. Father. Not master. Not overseer. Father. He flipped forward, his unease growing with every page. 1831, I heard shouting today, distant, but unmistakable. Something has happened beyond this place. I asked what it was, but no one would answer me. They say the outside world is dangerous. I begin to think it is no more dangerous than this one. As the years passed, the tone of the entries changed. At first, there had been confusion, then patience, then hope. But gradually, that hope had hardened into something else, frustration, then anger. 1836, Daniel is old enough now to understand. He looked at me today not with curiosity, but with fear. I am no longer just a secret. I am something he must pretend does not exist. Elias froze. Daniel. The same Daniel who lived in the house, who avoided conversation, who barely spoke during meals. The connection sent a chill through him. He turned more pages. 1840, Mother wept today. She said she wished things had been different. That she wished she had been braver. I asked her what she meant. She would not answer. Elias felt the pieces beginning to form, though he resisted the conclusion. Mother. Father. Daniel. This was not an outsider. This was someone within the family. By the time he reached the final entries, the handwriting had changed slightly. Not weaker, but heavier, as if each word carried more weight than before. March, 1852. I cannot remain here any longer. I have lived in this place for nearly 30 years. I have been hidden, silenced, reduced to something less than a person. I would rather face the world, whatever it may hold, than continue to exist like this. Elias leaned closer to the page, his heartbeat quickening. This had been written only months ago. I told Father tonight. He refused. He said it is impossible. That I would not survive. That I would bring shame upon them all. I told him I no longer care about shame. The next entry was shorter, almost abrupt. He looked at me as though I were already gone. Elias turned to the final page. There was only one line. If I am to disappear, let it be by my own choosing. There were no more entries after that. Elias lowered the journal slowly, his thoughts racing. Whoever had lived here had not simply been hidden, they had been erased from the world outside these walls. And now, they were gone. A faint sound broke the silence. Footsteps. Elias turned sharply toward the entrance, his grip tightening around the journal. A figure stood in the doorway, partially shadowed, watching him. Close the book, a quiet voice said. Elias hesitated for only a moment before obeying. As the figure stepped forward into the lantern light, he recognized her instantly. Clara Hawthorne. Her expression was not one of shock or anger, but something far more unsettling, resignation. You weren't supposed to find this, she said. Elias swallowed, steadying himself. I wasn't supposed to find a lot of things here. Clara stepped inside and gently closed the door behind her, sealing them both in the dim light of the lantern. She glanced at the journal in his hands, then back at his face. You've read it, she said. Yes. She nodded, as though confirming something she had already suspected. Then you understand. Elias shook his head slightly. Not completely. That's because you're still treating it like a mystery, Clara replied. It isn't. It's a decision. Elias felt tension tighten in his chest. What kind of decision? The kind that can't be undone, she said quietly. He looked down at the journal again. The person who lived here, who are they? Clara met his gaze directly. My brother. The words settled heavily between them. Elias blinked, trying to process it. Your brother? Yes. She stepped closer to the table, her voice steady but strained beneath the surface. He was born before me. Before Daniel. Before everything became controlled. Elias frowned. Why would your own family keep him here? Clara hesitated, then answered with quiet precision. Because he wasn't meant to exist. Elias shook his head immediately. No one is not meant to exist. In this place, at this time, that isn't how people think, she replied. He said nothing, but his silence urged her to continue. My mother isn't who people believe she is, Clara said. When my father married her, he gave the world a version of her that they would accept. Elias felt the realization forming again, stronger now. And your brother? He carried the truth, Clara said. In his face. In his skin. In a way that couldn't be hidden in plain sight. Elias clenched his jaw. So your father hid him instead? Yes. For 30 years. Clara nodded. He educated him, visited him, made sure he lived comfortably, as long as he stayed invisible. Elias looked around the room again, the carefully arranged space now feeling suffocating. This isn't protection, he said quietly. No, Clara agreed. It isn't. Elias's voice tightened. And now he's gone. Clara hesitated. Yes, she said. But not the way you think. Before Elias could respond, another voice cut through the air. I was wondering how long it would take. Both of them turned toward the door. Jonathan Hawthorne stood there, his presence filling the space with a cold, unyielding authority. This time, there was no attempt at politeness, no effort to maintain appearances. His expression was hard, controlled, and completely unyielding. You've seen enough, he said. Elias instinctively stepped back, but Clara did not move. You had one job, Jonathan continued. To count, record, and leave. Elias forced himself to hold his ground. And I intend to do exactly that. Then you will do it with the information I provide, Jonathan replied sharply. No, Elias said. The word seemed to hang in the air. Jonathan's gaze darkened as he stepped forward slowly. You don't understand what you're interfering with, he said. Then explain it, Elias replied. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Clara stood between them, tense but silent. Finally, Jonathan spoke again, his voice quieter now but far more dangerous. The person you're looking for is no longer here. Elias's chest tightened. What happened to him? Jonathan held his gaze without hesitation. I made sure he would never return. Elias felt the meaning immediately. You sold him, he said. Clara closed her eyes. Jonathan did not deny it. And in that silence, the truth became undeniable. This was not just a hidden life. It was a choice. A deliberate, calculated decision. And Elias understood then that this was no longer about a census, or missing numbers, or even a secret. It was about what he would do with the truth now that he had found it. Elias continued his journey across the counties, moving from one plantation to another, recording names, ages, and numbers with the same steady discipline he had always maintained. On the surface, nothing had changed. His work remained methodical, his demeanor calm, and his records precise. But internally, the Hawthorne estate had altered something in him. He found himself paying closer attention to hesitation, to silence, to the spaces between answers. Where once he had accepted inconsistencies as routine, he now examined them with quiet suspicion. The idea that someone could be erased so completely and deliberately refused to leave his mind. Weeks passed before the first signs appeared. It began as a conversation between two men at a roadside inn. Elias had stopped there for a meal and a place to rest, and as he sat near the window reviewing his notes, he overheard a familiar name. Hawthorne. He did not turn immediately, but he listened. One of the men spoke in a low, intrigued tone about a discrepancy in the recent census records. He mentioned that there had been an irregularity tied to a well-established family, something that did not quite add up. The second man responded with interest, asking questions, speculating. By the time Elias allowed himself to glance over, the conversation had shifted into rumor. A missing individual. An unaccounted presence. A suggestion that something had been hidden. Elias said nothing, but he understood immediately what had happened. The record he had written, brief and careful as it was, had not gone unnoticed. It had been read, questioned, and discussed. And now, it was beginning to spread. Hawthorne. He did not turn immediately, but he listened. One of the men spoke in a low, intrigued tone about a discrepancy in the recent census records. He mentioned that there had been an irregularity tied to a well-established family, something that did not quite add up. The second man responded with interest, asking questions, speculating. By the time Elias allowed himself to glance over, the conversation had shifted into rumor. A missing individual. An unaccounted presence. A suggestion that something had been hidden. Elias said nothing, but he understood immediately what had happened. The record he had written, brief and careful as it was, had not gone unnoticed. It had been read, questioned, and discussed. And now, it was beginning to spread. By the time Elias returned north months later, the story had grown. Not in clarity, but in scale. People spoke of the Hawthorne estate in uncertain terms. Some claimed there had been a death that was never reported. Others believed there had been a hidden illness, something shameful that the family had concealed. A few, more daring, suggested that there had been a person deliberately erased from existence. None of them knew the full truth. But the outline was there. And that was enough. Back at the estate, the effects were immediate and severe. Jonathan Hawthorne found himself facing questions he could not easily dismiss. Business partners who had once trusted him began to hesitate. Invitations to gatherings became less frequent. Conversations ended abruptly when he approached. The quiet respect he had cultivated over decades began to fracture. He maintained his composure in public, responding to inquiries with controlled denials and carefully constructed explanations. He insisted the discrepancy was a clerical error, a misunderstanding by an inexperienced enumerator. But the more he attempted to control the narrative, the more attention it seemed to draw. Within the household, the tension deepened. Eleanor withdrew almost entirely, spending long hours alone and rarely engaging in conversation. Her already fragile composure gave way to something heavier, a quiet grief that lingered in her expression. She avoided any mention of the past, as though silence might still protect what remained. Daniel grew increasingly rigid, throwing himself into work with an intensity that bordered on desperation. He avoided discussions about the situation, refusing to acknowledge the rumors or their implications. But his frustration surfaced in other ways, in sharp remarks, in impatience with workers, in a constant underlying agitation that never fully settled. Clara, however, changed in a different way. She did not retreat or harden. Instead, she became more observant, more deliberate in her actions. Where others avoided the subject, she seemed to confront it internally, as though trying to reconcile the truth with the life she had been raised to accept. It was Clara who eventually spoke first. One evening, as the family sat in strained silence, she addressed her father directly. "They're talking about us," she said. Jonathan did not look up immediately. When he did, his expression was composed, but there was a flicker of irritation beneath it. People always talk, he replied. This is different, Clara said. They're asking questions. Jonathan set his fork down carefully. And what would you have me do about that? Tell the truth, she said. The words landed heavily in the room. Daniel stiffened, but said nothing. Jonathan's gaze hardened. The truth is not something this world handles with fairness, he said. You should know that. Clara met his gaze without hesitation. Neither is a lie. For a moment it seemed as though he might respond sharply, but instead, he leaned back slightly, his expression shifting into something colder. This discussion is over, he said. But it was not. Not really. The situation escalated further when a letter arrived. It came from a contact in New Orleans, a trader known to the Hawthorne family. Jonathan read it alone in his study, his expression tightening as he moved through the contents. The letter confirmed what he had already known but had hoped would remain contained. The individual he had sold had passed through multiple hands. There was no clear record of their current location. They had been absorbed into the system completely. Lost. Jonathan folded the letter slowly, his mind calculating. The risk had not disappeared. If anything, it had grown. Because uncertainty invited curiosity. And curiosity, once sparked, was difficult to extinguish. Meanwhile, far from the estate, the consequences of Jonathan's decision continued to unfold in ways he could not control. The man who had once lived in the granary had not simply vanished. He had been moved, traded, and transported, but unlike many others, he carried something with him that could not be taken or erased as easily. He carried knowledge, education, memory. And most importantly, he carried the understanding that his life had been stolen, not by strangers, but by those who had claimed to protect him. That understanding changed everything. Back on the estate, the pressure became unbearable. Workers whispered more openly. Overseers found it harder to maintain authority. The sense of order that had once defined the plantation began to weaken, replaced by uncertainty and quiet unrest. Jonathan attempted to regain control through stricter enforcement, but it only deepened the divide. The more force he applied, the more fragile his authority appeared. Clara watched it all unfold with growing clarity. One evening, she walked alone toward the edge of the fields. The granary still stood where it always had, unchanged in structure but transformed in meaning. It was no longer a hidden place. It was a symbol, visible to anyone who knew where to look. She approached it slowly, her steps measured. For years, she had accepted its presence without question. Now, standing before it, she felt the weight of everything it represented. Not just her brother's absence, but her family's choices. She reached out and touched the wood of the door, her fingers tracing the grain as though trying to connect with something long gone. For the first time, she allowed herself to think not about what had been done, but about what could still be done. In the days that followed, Clara began making quiet inquiries. Careful ones. She asked about traders, about routes, about destinations. She listened more than she spoke, gathering fragments of information and piecing them together. She did not share her intentions with her family. Not with her father, who would forbid it. Not with Daniel, who would refuse to understand it. What she was considering was not just difficult. It was dangerous. But the alternative was worse. Doing nothing. The Hawthorne estate continued to decline under the weight of its own secrecy, but for Clara, the path forward had begun to take shape. Somewhere, her brother was still alive. She did not know where. She did not know in what condition. But she knew one thing with certainty. He had been counted once. And that meant he could be found. By the time autumn settled over the southern states, Clara Hawthorne had made her decision irreversible. She did not announce her departure, nor did she seek permission. She understood too well what the answer would be if she asked. Instead, she prepared quietly, gathering what little she could carry without drawing attention. A small amount of money, a change of clothes, and the fragments of information she had spent weeks collecting were all she allowed herself. The night she left, the estate was silent. The air carried the faint chill of the coming season, and the fields, once so carefully ordered, now felt distant and unfamiliar. Clara paused only once, standing at the edge of the property and looking back toward the house where she had spent her entire life. There was no hesitation in her expression. Only certainty. Then she turned and walked away. Clara's journey took her south, following trade routes that stretched through towns and ports where people passed constantly and records were rarely questioned. She moved carefully, aware of the risks, relying on observation more than inquiry. Every conversation was measured, every question indirect. The name she searched for was not written anywhere official. But traces remained. A trader who remembered a man who could read and write unusually well. A dock worker who mentioned someone who spoke differently from the others, who asked questions instead of avoiding them. A plantation overseer who complained about a difficult laborer who refused to forget where he came from. Each piece of information was small on its own. Together, they formed a path. Weeks turned into months, but Clara did not stop. In New Orleans, the trail became clearer. The city was crowded, restless, and filled with movement. Ships arrived and departed constantly, carrying goods and people in equal measure. It was the kind of place where someone could disappear completely or, if one knew where to look, be found again. Clara spent days moving through the markets and docks, listening more than speaking. She learned to recognize patterns in conversation, to follow threads that others overlooked. Eventually, one of those threads led her to a man who had seen what she was searching for. He didn't belong, the man said, leaning against a stack of crates as he spoke. You can tell when someone's different. Not just in how they look, but in how they carry themselves. Clara held her breath slightly. Where is he now? The man shrugged. Passed through here a while back. Wasn't staying quiet, though. That kind never does. What do you mean? He talked, the man said. Asked questions. Made others start thinking. That doesn't last long in places like this. Clara's chest tightened. What happened to him? The man hesitated, then spoke more carefully. They moved him again. North this time. Didn't want him causing trouble. North. The direction surprised her, but it also gave her something she had not had before. A clear path forward. While Clara searched, Elias Carter continued his work, but the Hawthorne estate never left his thoughts. The entry he had written remained only a small mark within official records, but he had begun to understand its impact. It had not exposed the full truth, but it had disrupted the silence. And silence, once broken, rarely restored itself completely. Months after leaving Georgia, Elias found himself reviewing records in a small office, comparing census data across regions. It was tedious work, but it required attention to detail, something he had always possessed. That was when he noticed it. A name. Not common, but not entirely unique either. What caught his attention was not the name itself, but the detail attached to it. A note indicating that the individual was literate. It was unusual enough to stand out. Elias leaned closer, reading the entry again. The age matched closely. The timeline aligned. And the location was farther north than expected. Clara's journey north was more difficult than the one that had brought her south. The further she traveled, the more uncertain the information became. But she did not turn back. By the time winter approached, she reached a smaller settlement where the pace of life was slower and the movement of people less constant. It was there that she heard something that stopped her completely. A teacher. Someone who had begun gathering others in secret, teaching them to read and write. The description was vague, but it was enough. Clara followed the directions she was given, her steps quickening despite her attempt to remain composed. The building she found was simple, almost hidden, but there were signs of life inside. Light flickered faintly through the cracks, and voices could be heard, low, careful, but present. She hesitated only for a moment before stepping forward. Inside, a small group of people sat together, their attention focused on a man standing near a table. He held a piece of chalk in his hand, writing slowly, deliberately, as he spoke. Clara felt her breath catch. Even before she saw his face clearly, she knew. There was something unmistakable in the way he moved, in the calm certainty of his presence. When he turned, their eyes met. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The room seemed to fade, the voices quieting as the weight of recognition settled between them. Years had passed. Time had changed them both. But not enough to erase what connected them. "Clara," he said finally, his voice steady but filled with something deeper. She stepped forward, her composure breaking for the first time since she had left home. "I found you," she said. The reunion was not simple. There were no easy words to bridge the years of separation, no way to undo what had been done. But there was understanding, and that was enough to begin. He told her what had happened after he was taken from the estate. The places he had been sent, the conditions he had endured, the people he had met. He spoke not with bitterness alone, but with clarity, as someone who had chosen to survive rather than disappear. "I decided I would not be what they made me," he said. "If I could not be free in the way I wanted, I would be free in the ways I could control." Teaching had become one of those ways. Sharing knowledge. Refusing silence. Clara listened, understanding now that his life had not ended when he left the granary. It had changed. Grown. Become something her father could never have imagined or controlled. Months later, Elias received a letter. There was no return address, only a brief message written in careful handwriting. He was found. He is alive. And he is no longer hidden. Elias read the letter several times, a quiet sense of relief settling over him. He did not know who had sent it, but he understood its meaning. The record had not been enough on its own. But it had been a beginning. The Hawthorne estate, once defined by control and silence, did not recover its former standing. The rumors never fully disappeared, and the questions never entirely faded. Over time, the family's influence diminished, replaced by others less burdened by secrets. The granary remained, but it no longer held power. It stood as a reminder. Not of what had been hidden, but of what had failed to stay buried. As for the man who had once lived within its walls, his name continued to be written. In small gatherings. In quiet lessons. In places where being seen and heard mattered more than being accepted by those who would deny it. He was no longer confined to a single space, no longer reduced to silence. He existed fully, not because the world had granted him permission, but because he had claimed that existence for himself. And in the end, that was something no one could take away again. The record remained. A single discrepancy in a ledger. A small act of defiance. But behind it was a life that refused to be erased. And that, more than anything, ensured that the truth endured.